In our first volume of Arcade Treasures, we looked at some coin-op games that I really thought you'd enjoy. And since most of you seem to have interest in that, let's take a look at even more arcade games that I think are worth playing today. These games range from run-and-gun shooters, beat-em-ups, and some really good vehicle-based shoot-em-ups with great graphics and sound. All of these games are available on MAME for you to try out, and should you run across an actual cabinet in the wild, do yourself a favor and drop a few credits into it. I hope you guys enjoy Arcade Treasures Volume 2. Beirut, or Beirut if you prefer, is a 1989 run-and-gun developed jointly between Sega and Sunsoft. With Contra out fresh in the arcade and home, this was their attempt to capitalize on the newfound love of the genre, and for the most part they succeed. There are multiple weapons to choose from, power-ups for those weapons, and the stages and enemies have some pretty good variety. There are vehicle-based stages, enemies that can hide and take cover, and the challenge is real. There are places where you need to practice numerous times before you pass it without eating a ton of deaths. But that's okay because this game has the replay value and fun factor to warrant it. I would have loved to have seen this on the Genesis in 1989, and with the simple presentation that should have been more than possible. A two-player run-and-gun at the time would have been great to have. It was done on the System 16 arcade board and is well worth playing even today. In 2000, a small Japanese software developer called Visco Corporation released a vertical shoot-em-up called Vasara. It mixes old and new technology in historical settings, similar to many other Japanese shoot-em-ups. You get the pretty standard choice of a few different characters here, and each one has a charged melee attack that does additional damage and can save you from enemy bullets. The audio-visual presentation here is top-notch thanks to the fantastic background detail, great looking enemies, and music that fits every scenario. Perhaps one of the best parts about these two games are that the story cinemas are completely subtitled in English text, meaning you can actually follow it even though it was released only in Japanese arcades. It kind of reminds me a lot of the stuff that would appear on the Dreamcast and PS2 around that time, though no physical home port was ever released. The good news about these two games is that they are now available digitally on modern platforms under the Vasara Collection. So if these games strike your interest, be sure to show some love to the license holders and support such retro releases. Some of you guys may remember Twin Eagle, a vertically scrolling shoot-em-up from Sega Corporation. Well, that game actually saw a sequel not many people know about called Twin Eagle 2: The Rescue Mission. It's done in a similar mold as the original, but now with much more detailed graphics and a ton more interaction in the backgrounds. Drop your secondary attack bombs and you can level entire city blocks here. Enemies on the ground need tending to as well, and the entire thing just looks so impressive. Each stage starts with you choosing your path. A, B, or C paths take you through each area how you want, and a second player can buy in at any time. Much of what you see is pre-rendered in nature, but nothing looks out of place and the animation really helps convey a great sense of scale. There is also a fair amount of variety in the things you can blow up, and as expected, there is plenty of challenge here. While the first game saw an NES port, the sequel here has not seen a home version to my knowledge. In 1992, Toaplan released a sequel to the much-beloved Truxton. It's a direct sequel and follows the original game's story and events. This one takes the approach that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and much of what you loved about the first is back. There are a handful of attacks that can be picked up, satellites to give you extra firepower, speed bonuses, and of course nukes to help you clear the screen out when you need it. The visuals are quite similar overall as well, particularly both the design and color usage. I also really appreciated some of the music here. It's funky and catchy all at once, and somehow fits the sci-fi theme of the game perfectly. You also get that famous challenge, and a death is rewarded with you being pulled back and having to redo an area you already cleared. While the original Truxton saw a few home ports, Truxton II here saw no such love. To my knowledge, it's only released physically on the FM towns. Thank God for MAME. In 1991, Desert Assault was released by Data East. This top-down run-and-gun shooter features up to 4 players simultaneous co-op action, and has a ton of weapons and vehicles for you to blow up till your heart's content. In 2020, this is, for all intents and purposes, Team America, the 2D video game, without all the vulgarity. Everything from the characters, bad guys, music, setting, it just all resembles the classic movie to a T. I kept expecting the chorus to come blasting out my speakers every time I played it. It was that overwhelmingly familiar 1980s feeling that movies and games like Rambo and Mercs gave you, just now bigger, louder, and with a lot more on screen. As a child of the 80s, I found that undeniably appealing, if nothing more than the nostalgia trip. Grab some buddies and blow shit up. It's what games like this were all about. In 1989, the horizontal shoot-'em-up Saint Dragon from Jellicoe was released in the arcade. It was developed by NMK, the same company that did Z-Blade on the Neo Geo. This is a slower, more methodical shooter that prizes technique and patience over speed and reflexes. It's visually nothing special, and while the music is okay, it's not going to blow you away either. What is nice is the rather unique gameplay. Your cybernetic dragon happens to have a tail that follows him around as he moves. This can be used to block enemy attacks and to damage enemy ships. And that's the draw to this one entirely. The cool gameplay hook allows you to play this quite a bit different from most shooters of the era. I really appreciated that in a world where these kinds of games are a dime a dozen, and often forgotten because they bring nothing new or different to the table. It saw numerous ports to microcomputers of the day, and there is a PC Engine port of it as well. In 1996, Mitchell Corporation released Osmond, a side-scrolling action platformer that bears more than a passing resemblance to Capcom's Strider. And you know what? I knew absolutely nothing about it. I never saw this in the arcade one single time, and it wasn't until years later that a YouTube video clued me into its existence. The reason why it reminds you so much of Strider is because it was worked on by a bunch of former Capcom employees who wanted to do an unofficial sequel. They changed around the setting and characters a bit, and here we are. And man, does this game play great. It retains many of the elements of Strider. Melee attacks, climbing all over stuff, being spun around stages, and large boss fights. The main character also has a power attack to help you out against the tougher enemies in boss fights. The visual appeal is immediate and undeniable. It's colorful, well detailed, and you just have to love those backdrops. This is quite a bit more difficult than Strider when you first pick it up. Because you are always close to the enemies and they are appearing right on top of you, it's easy to take damage. Once you get the feel though, this one is a winner all the way around. MAME remains the only way to play it to my knowledge. Sega wasn't the only company making superscalers in the arcade, and we received Tytos' Night Striker in 1989. This is another arcade game I knew nothing about until a home version showed up, that being the 1993 Japanese Mega CD port. There were then ports to the Saturn and PlayStation a few years later. But being able to go back via MAME and see this in its original form is what video game preservation is all about. The arcade was done on the Tytos Z system, the same hardware that did the Chase HQ games. This pretty much takes multiple elements from Sega's games and combines it into one 3D shoot 'em up. Your armored hover car can stay on the road or fly high into the air, but there are always enemies and obstacles to contend with. The control and shooting aspects are almost a carbon copy of Space Harrier, right down to the feel of it. This is not a bad thing, and combined with the excellent audio and visual elements, make this a must-play for fans of Sega's work. Stage design gives you various environments to fight in, and it has a progression system that allows you to choose your next stage. If you are looking to play it at home, the Saturn edition called Night Striker S is a great port, and has additional content as well. In 1990, Taito also released the Ninja Kids, a point-blank ripoff of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right down to the gameplay and music. No joke, I'm actually somewhat shocked they weren't sued for this. Aside from that obvious imitation, this is actually a fun multiplayer arcade experience. Much like the Turtles, you can play it 4 players at once, and each color-coded ninja has his own weapons and powers. A doomsday cult is calling forth the Dark Lord Satan himself, and only you and your ninja buddies can stop it. Gameplay is of the hack and slash variety, and you do have screen clearing ninja powers to help you out. This comes in the form of Golden Axe style magic that is often elemental. Stages range from city streets, rooftops, office buildings, construction sites, and of course they all end in a boss fight. It isn't top tier stuff necessarily, but it can be fun to mess around with, particularly if you enjoy beat 'em ups like this. It's lighthearted, doesn't take itself seriously, and is a game you can play with your kids. "1993's Knuckle Bash is a beat-em-up from Toaplan of all companies. Known mainly for their shoot-em-ups, this was a rare excursion away from that genre and was one of the last few games they produced before folding in 1994. What do you do when a corrupt group of assholes known as the Mad Bull Group shows up and starts messing around with your profession? That's right, wrestling fans, you start beating ass all over the city. This puts you in mind of stuff like Final Fight. Big characters and lots of punching, kicking, and grappling. The visuals are very early 90s and look like something that should have been on the Neo Geo. The sound is a bit disappointing overall, particularly since this came out after Streets of Rage. Beat 'em ups need great tunes and the stuff here is just okay. Luckily the gameplay is solid enough to hold it all together. You have your normal assortment of combos and jump attacks, and you get some wrestling moves to spice things up. You also get some special moves that do additional damage. Enemies can grab you too, so you risk damage whenever you go in for a grapple. The animation is good as well, and there is enough stage variety to satisfy a couple of dedicated play sessions. This is not at the level of the greats of the genre, but it doesn't have to be. What it does with enough fun to make it well worth playing. So there we go, 10 more games to visit, or maybe revisit, at your local arcade or thanks to MAME. I want to thank each and every one of you for your recommendations in my last video. I now have enough stuff that I've picked and you've recommended to do half a dozen more of these episodes. I think it's really important to keep these games alive within the hearts and minds of all gamers, because many of them have very few ways to play them. The kid that discovers an arcade treasure today could be the developer that buys the IP to make a sequel or remake tomorrow. We as a community have a responsibility to one another to keep the hobby together, to let nothing be forgotten, and to make sure it's all still here for tomorrow's generation. Hopefully these games will help you guys, and many others, in that quest. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.